Next.js 13 introduced a new way we build React and Next.js applications using the new app router, which is built on top of React Server Components, Suspense, and Streaming. In this video, we're going to take a Next.js app built using the Pages router and Prismic CMS as our content management system, and we're going to migrate that to use the new app router. The website that we're going to be working on is what you can see here. It's a simple website, but has the features that you would want to implement in any website that you're working on. It has three slices: this hero slice up top, this logo slices, and this slice down here, where you can have different content and text. It also has this shared navigation or the header up top, where we are sharing some links and also some call to actions. We also have a footer, and all of our pages share actually this navigation, this header, and this footer. And this is an opportunity to see how we would go about implementing layouts inside the app router, which is now a native feature in the app router and way easier to implement than how we used to do them in the pages router. We're going to see that together. We have a second page here, which is a dynamic Next.js page. We're going to actually look at dynamic segments or dynamic routes in the app router as well. And along the way, I'll explain the features or the file conventions that you would want to know in the app router. So hopefully by the end of this video, you have a better understanding of the foundation of the app router, so you would feel comfortable migrating your apps, at least incrementally, page by page, from the pages directory or the pages router to the app directory or the app router. So let's start by walking through the project or the current state of our project, which is a Next.js app, as I mentioned, built using the pages router, as you can see here, TypeScript and Tailwind CSS. Once we have a good understanding of how the project is set up, then we're going to jump into the Next.js documentation, talk about the reference or the resource there for the migration, and then I'm going to also introduce a blog post from the Prismic team, which actually talks about this migration from the Prismic side of things. And then we can combine the two together to then have our application deployed using the app router. So inside of our project, as you can see, we have this pages router at the top level, which is responsible for rendering different routes. For example, we have this index.jsx, which is our homepage, and this is the convention inside the pages router. Your index.js or any file inside of your pages router actually turns into a route. So for example, here we have this homepage or function that's responsible for actually rendering our homepage. And as you might have already known, we have this specific Next.js APIs in the pages router. Things like get static props, get server-side props, or get static paths to actually fetch data. So this is how we fetch data, and then we send it to our homepage. So we're fetching our specific page type with the UID of home for our homepage. And before I get into this layout, let's just talk about the page, and then I'm going to come back to this layout. And we are returning this page component or this page data coming back from our Prismic to the page, and the page is just getting this prop and passing it down to this slice zone, which is a component from Prismic React library, which actually selects the specific component that we have designed and we have written or we have coded to this slices that are coming from our pages. Now, coming back to this get static props, a way to implement shared layouts or settings inside of our Next.js app in the pages router. I'm also fetching this layout file or document from my Prismic repository. This is called layout. It's a custom type where you can define this navigation. So let me actually show you what that looks like. So if we go to Prismic.io, if I log in and go to my dashboard, we can see this layout document, which is a custom type, where we have defined, let me just zoom out of this a bit. By the way, this is using the new page builder. If you're using the previous page builder, you can send a request to get this update to use the new page builder. If you're creating a new repository, it's going to use this by default, but I have requested for this specific repository to use the new page builder. Nonetheless, we have the header and the footer section, and this is where we can actually implement settings and navigations or links or stuff that's going to be shared inside of our app. And now we are fetching that document inside of this get static props, and we're also passing that as a prop to our to the default export of our page, which is the component responsible for rendering the page. Now in Next.js or inside the pages router, there is no native way to have layouts. If you want to share a layout, you have to create components such as the one that I created. So let's just jump inside our components and actually look at this layout. So inside of this layout, I'm receiving the page and the layout to render the information that we need, such as metadata, this header and the footer. And then I'm just wrapping this children, which is anything that's passed or sent as a children inside of this layout. So back to our page component down here, we're just wrapping the content of our homepage inside of this layout, which is going to share this header and the footer. Now just jumping into another page that we have to contrast or to just show this how we would share this layout also with other pages. We have this UID or dynamic segment. It is wrapped inside of the square brackets, and then inside of it I have this index.tsx file, which is the React component responsible for rendering my dynamic components. Right up top here inside the page component, you can see I'm reusing this layout again to then wrap that other dynamic routes inside of this shared layout as well. Now this is something that will be drastically easier or different in the app router, whereby you could just expose or export a specific file called layout.js or JSX or TSX, and then automatically the rest of the pages or sub pages from that point on are going to share that layout. So you would actually see that we would, instead of having to duplicate this component and the data fetching, we just define this once, and then all of our pages are going to share that specific component. Now inside of this dynamic segment, now that we're here, we have this get static props again. To fetch the specific page, we're getting the params.uid from Next.js. This is passed as a context object to our get static props, so we know what page the user is actually trying to access. Using that UID, we're fetching the specific document from our Prismic repository, and then we're also fetching for the layout and passing all that to our page component. Now inside of your dynamic routes, as you already know, you should export a get static paths as well, and this is to instruct Next.js what pages, what dynamic pages needs to be pre-built at build time. So here we're getting all of our pages, and we are returning a paths array again to identify which pages need to be built statically at build time. Now on top of this paths array, we have to also return this fallback option from our get static paths, and that defines how our app would behave if a user is trying to access a page that we have not statically built. The possible options are true, false, and blocking. The true is going to actually go ahead and show a fallback to the user and then generate that page on demand, and then switch the fallback with the page once it's ready. The false, it's just going to 404, and the blocking is just going to generate that page on demand, but it is not going to show a fallback state. Now you might have already known this stuff. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because I want to contrast this with how this API has changed, so you know how to implement this functionality in the app router. Now going back to our pages folder, we covered the homepage and this UID dynamic segment. We have the underscore app. This is going to be your custom app, and underscore document. And we're going to talk about how in the app router, these two are just combined into one file, and that's your root layout. We have this slice simulator. This is to simulate your slices as you're coding them without needing to have data from your repository that you already probably know. And for API endpoints, you would have to create an API folder inside of your pages router where you can have different endpoints. For example, we have the preview functionality hooked up with Prismic to have previews before our content creators actually publish a specific content. They can preview it on our site on the development or on our deployed version. and then the exit preview to just go back to the unpublished or the published version of the site. Now, let's also look at Prismic config from a high level. Here we have this Prismic IO where we define different routes or the structure of our application. So Prismic knows how our app and routes are actually created. And then we have this create client function, which we used inside of the get static props or get server side props to actually connect and fetch data from our Prismic repository. We are enabling the preview functionality specifically for Next.js projects using this Prismic Next that comes from this Prismic Next library. Again, you probably already know this stuff, but this is the create client function that we used inside of our get static props or get server side props. Now going back, we also have this slice machine config where we defined our repository name and then the URL or the path where our slice simulator lives if we wanted to use that functionality. And also we have this slices folder where we hold the components responsible for actually rendering this individual slices. For example, we have this hero slice where it receives this slice data from Prismic that's passed to it from the page. And this is the React component responsible for rendering the hero slice. Again, you have this custom types, which is again translated or copied over from your slice machine. Once you create your custom types and save this from your slice machine to your code base, which you might have already know. So with this, we have a good understanding of how our app is now working or how it's structured. Let's just start the process of thinking about the migration. I'm going to go to the Next.js documentation, and inside of the docs, there's this upgrading section and an app router migration guide, which you can use to step-by-step migrate your app to this new concept or to this new structure. Now, one thing I want you to know is the app router was introduced in Next.js 13, and it is now fully stabilized in Next.js 14. Next.js 14, which was released in October 2023, actually doesn't have any new API. And the only thing that was left experimental from the first release, which was the server actions, just became stable in Next.js 14. So Next.js 13 and 14 can be used interchangeably because there's no new APIs in 14 compared to the 13. It's just that server actions, which is a way for you to mutate data in the server, is now fully stable. Now, Next.js 13 introduced this new router called the app router, which is built on top of React server components that enable you to fetch data right inside of your components because you can turn them into asynchronous functions and await any asynchronous tasks such as connecting to your database, fetching data from your CMS repository or any other third-party library or API endpoint for that matter right inside of your component. So you no longer need Next.js specific APIs such as get static props or get server-side props. You can just fetch data right inside of your component, and we're going to see that in a second. But one thing that I want to mention is that the app router in Next.js 13 or 14 can coexist with the pages router. And this is where the idea of incremental migration comes into play. You don't have to instantly change everything to the app router. You can still continue using the pages router and incrementally adapt or bring pages into this new app router. They can work alongside each other. There will actually be two separate apps that you could just run at the same time. So scrolling down on this upgrade or migration guide from the Next.js documentation, the first thing that we know is that your Node.js version should be 18.7 and up. So this is one thing that you must know, and also your Next.js version. So the first thing that you would want to do is upgrade your Node.js version if you're using a lower version of Node.js, and also run this script that actually upgrades Next, React, and React DOM to the latest versions. I've already gone ahead and done this, so if you're following along, you can just go ahead and run this script. By the way, the link for this project on GitHub is going to be in the description, so you can clone that and actually follow along with me here. Now, once you have upgraded Next.js and React to the latest versions, you can also do so for the ESLint next config by running this script here. This is going to be specific to the app router, or it is going to give you lint errors specific to the new features. Also, if you are using the ESLint extension in VS Code, you should go ahead and actually restart it so it picks up on this new config and the new versions. Now, in the next step, it talks about the new features in Next.js 13. This is things like the improvements that were made to image components, the link component, the script component, and the new Next font package that you can use in the pages router or inside the app router. So this is not specific to the app router. These components are the components that you can still continue to use and benefit from the optimization or from the improvements inside of your pages router if you actually upgrade your Next.js app. But we're going to continue with the migration guide. Now here it talks about the file conventions and the new concepts or features in the app router. From a high level, it supports nested routes and layouts. This is an easy way for you to share a layout or nested layouts between different routes. You would create routes by defining folders or creating folders, and you would create pages or make them accessible publicly by including a page.js or TS if you're using TypeScript inside of these folders. So for example, if for the about page inside the pages router, you had about.js, now in the app router, you would create a folder called about, and then you would create a page.js inside of that folder, and that would make that route accessible at /about for your page. Now, there is a special file convention in the sense that there are different files you can export or you can include inside each of these routes or folders that you create in the app router, but the two most common ones are page and layout. So page is to define the UI for the specific route and make it publicly accessible. And the layout is to define UI that's shared across multiple routes. Now we're going to use this concept to actually implement the layout that I showed in our app, but in an easier way inside the app router. Now the other thing that's good to know is that you can co-locate other files inside the app router. So you can put in your components, your styles, your tests and whatnot all inside the app router, because by default, they're not going to be considered a route unless you export a page.js or route.js from these folders to make them a page, a UI, or an endpoint, like an API endpoint, which we're going to talk about using the route handlers. So you can co-locate them, whereas in the pages folder or router, any file that you put inside the pages router will become a route. So this is another difference between the two. Now, data fetching functions like get server-side props and get static props are no longer needed. As I mentioned, you can fetch data right inside of your components using the Fetch API that has been extended by React and Next.js to include and implement caching and revalidation. We're going to also look at that in a second, or use your database connection or SDKs to fetch data right inside of your component. So you no longer need a Next.js specific API to fetch data, which is one of the features or benefits of using the app router. Data fetching, as far as the developer experience goes, in my opinion, is way easier. Now, get static paths. This is the function that we use to define what pages would be built statically at build time, has been replaced with generate static params. In a similar fashion, we're going to return the segments for our dynamic routes that we want Next.js to actually go ahead and build at build time. Now, the underscore app, this is your custom app or underscore document, has been combined into one single layout. We call this the root layout. We're going to create this together in a second. The underscore error has been changed to error.js. You can actually have these error boundaries per route or per segments. The 4.4 has been replaced with the not found.js. And then your API endpoints can still remain in the pages if you want to use them, or you can use route handlers, which is the equivalent of API endpoint in the app router, which no longer need to be specifically in the API folder. You can just put a route.js or TS in any segment and would turn that folder or segment into an endpoint. Now, step one is creating the app directory. So inside of our project, let's actually go this. Let me close this off. And we're going to create a new folder called the app. This is where we're going to host our new app router. Now, we have already upgraded our Next.js version, so we can go to the second step. And this is to create our root layout. So we have to include this inside of the app router to work, and you would see it in a second. So we're going to create a layout.tsx file, and inside of it, we're going to copy this. This is, as I mentioned, is a combination of your underscore app and underscore document. This is where the HTML and body tag for your page is actually created by Next.js, and any sub page or layout is going to be passed inside as a children here. And as you can see in the comments, it explains that this layout must accept the children prop, which is going to be populated with nested layouts and pages. So I'm going to get out of this. Now to create our homepage, I can just add a page.tsx file here, and then let's export a React function. Let's call this home, and here we can just say this is our home page. Let's save this up, and now for this not to clash with the other home page that we have, let's just go ahead and delete this app and index file. So let's delete all of them. Now if I go back to our application, we should be able to see this new component rendering our home page from inside of our app router. Let me fix this typo here. Let's actually go ahead and apply some classes to this to test and see if Tailwind is working. So text3xl. As you can see, if I refresh the page, this is not taking effect. Now, there's two reasons for this. First, you have to add the app router to your Tailwind config. I've already done this. So if you haven't, you have to actually instruct Tailwind to pick up the content of your app router. But the reason why this is not working now is, as I mentioned, the app router is a separate app from the pages router. So we need the styles that we were using inside of the pages router to also be applied or duplicated here inside of our app. So I have to create a new file here called globals.css, where I can go ahead and copy the CSS that I had implemented inside of the pages router, copy them here. Let me close this off, go back to our layout. We have to import our CSS over here. So globals.css. And now if I save this, our Tailwind is actually kicking in, and this is working. Now that we're here, let's actually also show a sample page here. So if I were to create an about page, as I mentioned, we create routes with folders. So I would create an about folder, and inside of it, as soon as you put in a page.tsx file, this is going to be the React component responsible for your about page. It makes this a specific segment, this about segment, accessible. So now if I go to /about page, we should be able to see that about page there as well. Awesome. So now let's go back to the documentation and see what's the next step. So we have created our root layout and explained that this is actually rendering our HTML and body tag, combining the underscore app and underscore document from what we had before in the pages router. Now, another thing that you should know is that the next head component, or the head component that we used to expose metadata from the pages router, no longer works inside the app router. Instead, we can use the new metadata API by exporting a metadata object from every page or layout, or actually using the generate metadata function if we need to dynamically generate the metadata. I'm going to show this when we actually implement the layout in the app router. So we're going to skip this for now. We talked about the next head or the metadata object. Now, migrating pages, as I mentioned, we have already created our homepage, created a sample about page, as you can see here. And it will be the similar concept for our dynamic pages as well, where you would create a dynamic folder like so, and then include a page.js or TS inside of it for your dynamic segments. We're also going to do that together here. Now, when migrating your routes from the pages router to the app router, the most important thing to keep in mind is that your pages inside your app router are server components by default. And your pages inside the pages router are client components by default. So to not break your app when you're migrating pages to the app router, a pattern that you can use, or it's recommended by this migration guide from the docs, is that you're going to export your page component into a new client component inside the app router. And to create client components inside the app router, we're going to use the use client directive. As you can see here, this turns a component into a client component. And why would you want to turn a component into a client component? Where anytime that you're using React hooks or any library that depends on React hooks, such as useState or useEffect or React context, you need to use a client component. Anytime that you need to use event listeners or any user interactivity that depends on a client component or the features from the browser APIs, you need a client component. Now, because your pages inside the pages router are by default client components, one way to not break your app during this migration is to create client components inside of your app for every page. For example, here, they're trying to actually migrate the homepage. So they're creating a homepage component where they're just copying over whatever component they had in the pages router. And then they're going to create this page.tsx as we just did, and they're going to import that homepage component, which is a client component, inside of this page. Now this page, which is the page.tsx that is going to render their homepage, is actually a server component. So they're importing a client component into a server component. Now this is a pattern that you're going to see. You can interleave client components and server components inside the app router. Basically, anytime that you're fetching data, is better to do this computation on your server side, and then anytime you need client-side interactivity or React states or hooks or any browser APIs, you're going to move them to the leaves of your application to include or to create client components. Now, you might need to do this, or you might prefer to actually, when you're doing the migration, decide whether or not this specific component needs any client-side interactivity, and then avoid this duplication of creating this component. It's up to you, but the easiest way is to just create these components, mark them as use clients, and import them into whatever page that's responsible for rendering them. So therefore, it is not going to break your app, depending on whether or not your components are actually using React or browser APIs or need any user interactivity. We're not going to follow this pattern here inside of our own app, but you're more than welcome to actually start by this pattern to understand how to migrate and not break your application or your page component, and then try to recompose or abstract them in a different way once you got comfortable inside of the app router. Now down here, another thing that I want to mention is your use router hook. Now, use router hook was a way for you to access your router to programmatically, for example, navigate the user to a different route on the client side, to use the current query object or the current path that the user is on. This has been divided into 3 different hooks inside the app router. So your use router hook from the next router package doesn't work inside the app router. Instead, you can use these 3 different hooks to access the router. There is a specific hook to access the path name or the current path that the user is on. It's called the use path name, or the use search params, which is going to give you the query object. This is your query string in the URL, and they're all exported from next navigation and not the next router. So the next router or the previous version doesn't work in the app router. This is another thing that you want to keep in mind. Now down here, the last step is migrating the data fetching methods. This is talking about your get server side props, get static props, get static paths, and how they're different. As I mentioned, there is no get server side props or get static props needed. Instead, we're using the fetch API. This is an extended version of fetch, which is going to support stuff like caching and next revalidation to mimic the behavior of static generation or incremental static regeneration from or server-side rendering from the pages router. So in order to statically render a page, something similar to get static props, you're going to pass a function, an object, to your fetch function that sets the cache to force cache. Now, this is the default, which means if you do not include this option, Next.js is going to try to cache as much as possible to statically render your pages and only opt into dynamic rendering when it's needed. Now, to have a behavior similar to get server-side props or a dynamic rendering, at request time, you can set the cache to no store, which is going to instruct Next.js to actually fetch this data on demand at request time, similar to get server-side props. Now you can also have the revalidate option passed to your fetch function. Again, this is an extension of the fetch API. You can pass in this objects such as next revalidate to 10 to have a similar behavior where you had this incremental static regeneration inside the pages router, where you would generate your pages statically, but then instruct Next.js to refresh this cache and revalidate or regenerate these pages after a specific amount of time, in this case 10 seconds. Now you can continue reading this part of the documentation on your own to see this implementation and the contrast between the pages router and the app router. I want to go ahead and actually implement what we have learned in our homepage and connect it with Prismic in the same manner to fetch our data, which brings me to a blog post that the Prismic team has actually put together to look at this migration from the Prismic side. It's a great blog post. There's going to be a link in the description so you can actually read through this as well. Now, what you need to do on the Prismic side is also update all of your packages to the next or latest version so they support the new app router. So once you did this, if you already created your project, you don't need to run the slice machine init script. If it is a new project, you could run this script. This is going to actually install the required dependencies and pretty much create all the endpoints and all the pages that you require for the preview functionality or for your slice simulator. It's going to also initialize your app with the Prismic IO and the slice machine config. But I am assuming that you already have an application. This is pretty much is going to be the same thing between the app router and the pages router. You just have to upgrade your Prismic specific packages like the Prismic React and Prismic Next to use the latest versions. Now, the only thing that we would want to change, or we have to change, is inside of this create client function that we defined in our Prismic IO. We touched on it briefly before. We want to pass in some fetch options. Now, as we have already seen in the documentation, this is how we are actually implementing static behavior versus dynamic behavior. So we want to actually replicate that inside of our create client. So let me just go to the create client function that we have inside the Prismic IO. This is where we're going to actually add those functions. So let me copy this code from here. So here, what we have added to our file is this fetch options to this create client function from Prismic. And if we are in production, we're actually tagging our cache with this Prismic. This is going to help us to revalidate the data that comes from Prismic by creating a revalidate endpoint. We're going to see this at the end. And we're using the force cache to actually cache as much as possible. And then if we're not in production, we're actually revalidating our cache every 5 seconds. So you can play around with this to actually implement what suits your use case. But this is recommended from Prismic folks to actually change inside of our create client. And that's pretty much everything that you need to do as far as migration from the pages to the app router from the perspective of Prismic. So let's go back to our homepage. Let me just close all of this, guys. Go back to our homepage and see what we need to do here to bring in our homepage. I'm going to copy this code over here so you don't have to watch me code, but then I'm going to explain step by step what I'm doing here. So ignore the generate metadata function for now. We again have a home function that is responsible for rendering our homepage. Inside of it, I'm getting my client. This is the create client function that we just created in Prismic IO. This is allowing us to fetch data. And because this is a server component inside the app router now, I'm able to turn this into an async function, which allows me to await data fetching or my data right inside of my component. So I no longer need an extra get static props or get server-side props function over here. Now here, I'm getting the page type with the UID of home, catching any errors, and rendering this not found function that just invokes or renders our not found page, which means that you have to include a not found page inside of your app router. I don't have it. But if you want this to work, you have to have that not found page already existing in your app router, and then this not found function from Next navigation is just going to return that 404. And then once we have this page back, we're sending it to the slice zone. This is a similar component that we have from Prismic React that takes in the data coming from Prismic and our slices from our code base and render our pages. Okay, so let's save this up, go back to our application, go back to our home page. Now, as you can see, I'm getting an error here that says I'm using a client-side interactivity or React hooks in a component that's not marked as a client component using this use client directive. So let's go to our slider and inside of our slices and see if we can spot what this is. So inside of our slices, we have this slider. This is actually using React hooks, but it is not marked as a client component. So let's add this use client directive and save this up. Let's refresh our page. And there you have it. Our slices are back. Apparently, this is the only slice where we were using stuff from React hooks or maybe event listeners to actually have this slider component functionality, or maybe this swiper module is using useRef, user states, or contexts under the hood. So we needed this use client to mark this component as a client component, so we can use those type of functionality coming from React or anything from the browser API. Okay, but right now we don't have the layout, so there is no navigation up top or a footer down in the bottom. So let's next actually implement our layout. Let's go to this layout, which is our root layout actually shared between all of our pages. I'm going to again copy some code here and show you what we're doing here and explain everything in between. Let me just close this off and that off. So inside of here, from a high level, again, I'm going to come back to the metadata, and I forgot to explain the generate metadata function on the homepage. We'll do that in a second. But from a high level, what we're doing inside of this root layout is actually returning the HTML and body tag, which was required from Next.js, but actually providing some components that are going to be wrapping our whole application. Things that we implemented inside of this specific layout component in the pages router. Things like the header, the main, and the footer are now just living inside of our root layout. And more interestingly, we are fetching the layout data right here inside of our root layout. So we're getting the create client function, and we're getting this single layout document from Prismic to pass into our header and footer to correctly show our navigation links, our CTA buttons, and our footer stuff here. And the beauty is that we don't have to repeat this for any other page. We just implement this once inside of our root layout or any other layout by exporting a layout.js or TS file. We can perform any data fetching that we want there, because our layouts are, again, a React server component. You can turn them into async functions and fetch data, connect to your database, connect to your CMS right there inside of your components and use that data. So it saves us the duplication of passing this layout around or actually fetching the required data. Now, as you can see, we have some more errors over here because apparently we are using some functionality for our component inside of our header component. So let's go back to our header component. So components header, we're using the same thing for here. Now let's also mark this as a client component by exporting this use client directive up top. Now we're using some fonts. Let me actually also copy this fonts to our component. Let me close this off. Inside of this lib, we have some fonts. These are custom fonts that we are using inside of our application using the Next font package. So now with that, we have our navigation or header component back. And if we scroll down, we have our footer back, but all of which is just served up from the new app router. Now that we're here, let's actually talk about the fonts real quick too. Using the new Next font package, it allows you to serve up some local fonts, and that's what we're doing here. So you get the local fonts function from this Next font /local. The Next font package also includes all the Google fonts. So you can dive into the documentation for this segment if you're interested. But basically, this local font function allows you to serve up your fonts locally from your project, which optimizes your fonts and minimizes the layout shift when the users are actually loading these fonts. And we are using these fonts inside of our root layout. So let me just close this off. We are bringing these fonts in and passing them to the body tag. We are actually accessing the variable function. This way we are setting CSS custom variables for these fonts, which we can use from our Tailwind CSS to apply fonts. Now that goes beyond the scope of this tutorial, but I do have a dedicated video on my channel. I'm going to make sure to include a link in the description where I talk about the new Next font package and how you can combine or use it with Tailwind CSS inside the app router. Also, if you want to dive deeper into data fetching in the app router and contrast it with the pages router for things like server-side rendering, static generation, or incremental static regeneration, specifically when we are not using the fetch API, I do have a dedicated video. I'll make sure to include that link in the video as well. Now, with that out of the way, let's just quickly talk about this metadata object and the generate metadata function we had on our homepage before diving into our dynamic UID route. So as I mentioned, you cannot use the next head component for metadata inside the app router. Instead, you can just export a metadata object where you can pass in or specify metadata tags or information for that specific page. And if you want to dynamically generate this metadata function, as we did inside of our homepage, you can use this generate metadata function and return an object from it where you pass in or export title, description, open graph information and images and descriptions from each of your pages. Now let's actually go back to our app and create a component or a page for our dynamic UID pages. So again, we're going to create a dynamic folder called UID, square brackets to show this is a dynamic segment. And I'm going to include a page.tsx inside of it here. Let's also go ahead and copy some code and see what we're doing here. So going back, let me just close this generate metadata function and generate static params. I'm going to explain what these are in a second. Now, from a high level, our page component actually looks a lot like our homepage. All we're doing is creating this client and using it to fetch this specific page document from Prismic by passing in the params UID. Now, the params object is going to be provided to all pages and layouts component by Next.js. So you have access to the specific UID that the user is trying to access. We're passing this to our get by UID function from Prismic to fetch this specific page. And once we have the page, we're passing it to our slice zone component, similar to what we did inside of our homepage. Again, if we are encountering any error, we're passing or invoking this not found function, which makes me actually create this not found page as well. So let me copy this over and show you how we will go about doing this. So this not found function is actually an error page showing some buttons to go back to the home page and also having a metadata function. Now, anytime inside any page, if you invoke this not found function, Next.js is going to render that not found component that we just created together. Now, coming back to our application, we can actually see we are getting an error for conflicting route inside the app and pages router. This is because we have to now delete this dynamic pages from inside of our pages folder. So I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this one so we don't have any conflicting routes and everything is now being served up from our app router. Now, if I try to refresh this page and go to our another page, we should also be able to see our another page rendered up without any problem going back to our home page. Now, with that, the only two things we have remaining in the pages router is our API endpoint and this slice simulator. So we're going to copy this slice simulator to our app. Let's just move this up there. This is going to live inside of our app folder here. And this is already using the use client directive. I forgot to delete this. So it's using the use client, which marks this component as a client component. So it performs correctly as our slice simulator. And now for our API endpoint, we need to create API endpoints or routes inside of the app. Now, to create API endpoints in the app router, you don't need to necessarily put them inside the API folder, just as you had to in the pages router. You can just create endpoints by exporting or creating a route.js or route.ts file in any of your route segments, which in turn turns that specific segment into an endpoint. But to keep things smooth in our migration, I'm going to also create an API folder or a folder called API inside the app router, where I define different routes here. So we have the same naming convention. Let me now just go ahead and delete this component from our pages. So our pages component no longer contains anything, and we can just go ahead and delete the pages component altogether. Now let's also dive inside the API route and see what we're doing here. I've created 3 endpoints. We have this preview. We are exporting a route.ts from this preview folder, which is going to turn this into an endpoint. We're using this named functions. This is a convention for creating or using route handlers in the app router. You have to export named functions that are going to correspond to a specific HTTP verbs or methods like get, post, patch, delete, and whatnot. And here what we're doing is, again, using this create client and this redirect to preview URL to enable the preview functionality in our app. We have a similar route for our exit preview. This is to exit out of the preview and go back to the published version of our site, whether it is in your local development or it is in your production. I'm sure there's going to be other tutorials on the Prismic channel where they explain how to actually implement this if you don't know it from the perspective of setting this up inside your Prismic repository. But for now, we're just assuming that you already have this functionality and you just want to migrate it to the app router. And then we are going to create, or we have already created, a route for revalidating our data. This is using a post function or a post route handler, which is going to use the revalidate tag function from Next cache to revalidate anything that we have tagged as Prismic anytime we are hitting this endpoint. So the idea is, inside of your Prismic repository in your settings, you can set up a webhook to hit this endpoint anytime you're making a change or your content creators are making a change, publishing, unpublishing documents in Prismic. Prismic is going to hit this endpoint, which you have defined here. It's going to be your domain or your deployed version, whatever URL you have, API/revalidate, which is going to invoke this function. This function is going to call this revalidate tag function from Next.js, which is going through the Next.js cache and revalidating or regenerating anything that was tagged with Prismic. Now, if you remember in the beginning, I mentioned where we are tagging this inside of our Prismic IO. When we are creating this create client function, we pass this fetch options that is going to tag whatever we are using or whatever data we are fetching using this create client function with Prismic. So therefore, when in the revalidate endpoint, we are actually revalidating our Prismic tag, it's going to go ahead and refetch this data from Prismic, reflecting whatever content that our team has published or unpublished, and this is going to just return a next response saying that the revalidation actually was successful. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. I know we covered a lot, so let's recap. We migrated a Next.js application from Pages router powered by Prismic to the app router. The first step was to update all of our packages, Next.js, React, React DOM, and also Prismic specific packages to the latest version so we can use these features. We then created an app directory or an app folder in the root of our application to allow us to use the new app router. We learned that it is required for us to include a root layout inside of our app router that wraps all of our pages with the HTML and body tag. Then for each page that we had inside of our pages router, we had to create a folder to represent the segment and include a pages.js or tx file if you're using TypeScript to actually make that route publicly accessible. The page.tsx or JS was just a React server component that's responsible for returning the UI for that specific segment. Now, React server components is one of the major differences between the app router and the pages router, and that it changes the way we used to fetch data. We learned that we no longer need Next.js specific functions like get static props or get server side props. Instead, we could just directly fetch data inside of our page component, because at the end of the day, they're just asynchronous functions. You can evade any data fetching method or asynchronous task for that matter to fetch the required data. We also learned to be able to use any user interactivity, browser APIs, or hooks from React. We have to mark our components with the use client directive. And that was a recommended way to migrate our apps, where you would create client components inside the app router and then import them from that specific page so you don't break them when you're migrating. We didn't follow that path. We just decided on the go, if a component requires to be a client component, basically reading the errors in the browser and mark them as client components and leave everything else as a server component. Now, as a general rule of thumb, you should try and keep as much as you can on the server using server components to offload all of those dependencies and compute to the server, and only include or create client components when you need user interactivity, the browser API or event listeners and whatnot, and leave them at the leaves of your React component tree. Another thing that we mentioned as a difference between the app router and the pages router was that layouts were native, just like the root layout, which we used to also include our header and footer component. You can also have nested layouts for each segment. For each folder inside of the app router, you can have a different layout. And again, if that's something that you want to dive deeper, check out my channel. I live and breathe React and Next.js there, so you should be able to find whatever topic that you're trying to learn in Next.js 13. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments. And other than that, I'm signing out. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.